In this vignette, I'll be reviewing the new deployment strategy used in ActiveVOS 8 called contributions, and specifically how it relates to our previous deployment strategy. The primary focus for today is on migrating existing processes to ActiveVOS 8. Prior to version 8, our deployment script would basically run in two phases. The first phase would deploy resources like WSDL, schema, and forms, and only replace those resources if a flag was checked during deployment. The second phase would then deploy each of the PDDs and BEEPL processes that passed validation. With this approach, it was possible to deploy new resources for process A that could have a negative impact on process B, which might have relied on some of the same resources. An example would be in the case where subprocesses are used, but only one of the processes is made aware of the resource changes. So in ActiveVOS 8, we've introduced the concept of contributions. A contribution is a container that consists of processes and all of the resources that are used by those processes. In a nutshell, we treat everything as one cohesive package that all gets versioned together. To accommodate for contributions, we've added a few new console pages within our resource catalog. To alleviate common resources from being bundled within multiple deployments, we've also introduced project dependencies, where your common artifacts would only need to be deployed once, then can just be referenced by other contributions. The primary benefit of contributions is that because processes and resources are tightly bundled and versioned together, changes made by other developers will not impact your contribution. You can essentially have multiple versions of things like WSDL, schema, and POJOs all running at the same time. Rolling a process back to a previous version is also much easier because the underlying resources, like task forms for instance, will be rolled back with them. Project dependencies allow you to either hide or expose resources to other contributions, and there's now a much more clear picture of exactly how and when resources were updated within the catalog. As I mentioned, the resource catalog has been extended to accommodate for our new strategy. By default, deployment contributions will include all resources within your project. As you'll see, you do have the option of filtering out some of the project artifacts, like sample data, simulation models, and things like that. For all resources, we update the major version number if the resource has been updated. We increment the build number version or minor version number if the resource hasn't changed since the last deployment. After you deploy, your contribution will be in one of these states. Online indicates that the contribution is current. Offline pending lets you know that either older process instances are still executing or that the contribution is being imported by another contribution. Offline contributions are essentially old process deployments and they can be deleted. Individual catalog entries are either online or offline. Online resources are essentially the default for any running processes. Offline entries are also available, but primarily by in-flight processes that require that specific version number. When upgrading to ActiveVOS 8, it's recommended that your projects be redeployed using the same type of export steps as you did in previous versions. However, instead of exporting individual PDDs, you'll just export the entire project as a single contribution. If redeploying isn't a reasonable option, ActiveVOS 8 will support deploying older beepers that haven't been repackaged as a contribution. These will appear as a special legacy type of contribution, which will behave slightly differently than a standard 8.0 contribution. Legacy contributions can be created by either deploying a legacy beeper directly from the console, or one large legacy contribution will be created when you upgrade your enterprise installation using the database upgrade script. Let's take a brief look at how contributions work within ActiveVOS 8.0. Let's start by taking a look at the ActiveVOS console. I'm in the resource catalog and we can see that there's currently nothing deployed. There are no contributions. I'll go back to Designer and we'll export our request for quote project using the new deployment strategy. The project contains two processes here and an additional one in the event monitoring folder. Previously, I'd probably deploy each of these PDD files separately, but now I'll just export the entire project as a single contribution. From this panel, I can see exactly what artifacts will be deployed with the contribution. The top section contains resources that are directly used by the processes themselves. And this bottom section lists other resources within my project that will also be deployed as part of this contribution. You can manually add or remove resources from the list. And we also have an Eclipse project setting that allows you to customize which folders should automatically be excluded from the export operation. We get the regular deployment summary showing us that 3 processes were deployed. Let's go back to the console and refresh the contribution page. I'll select the contribution that was just deployed and we'll take a look at the details. And here we see the 3 processes, and they're all online. Here's a list of other resources that were bundled with this contribution. Imported namespaces are items that are not directly part of my project. In this case, it's a few system services that we use. Dependent contributions would list other contributions that were deployed, which this one relies on. And you always have access to the deployment log from here. Now let's take a look at another project which had previously been deployed with ActiveVOS 7. Again, there are 2 processes in this project. Let's deploy these old beepers to see what legacy contributions look like when they're brought into ActiveVOS 8. I'll deploy the doXML transformation beeper first. Now let's refresh the page. I've got a version 1.0 of my legacy deployment contribution, so let's take a look at the details. The doXML transform process is deployed as version number 1, and its status is online. Now let's deploy the other beeper from the same project, the shipper beeper. The legacy contribution is now at version number 2, and when we look at the details, I'll only see the latest process that we deployed. With this legacy contribution, it looks like the doXML transform process is no longer available. But if I go to the process definitions page, I can see that both services are in fact still online, and both are on version number 1. Now let's go back to Designer one more time and redeploy this project using the new contribution strategy within 8.0. First, I'll delete the old style beeper and beeperd files. And now I'll just export the project as I did with the quote project. When we look at the contributions page again, we can see the new deployment is available. Let's take a look at it. And there's 2 new processes. Both are version number 2, and both are online. Let's take a look at the legacy contribution. And here we can see that the shipper, version number 1, is offline. The same would be true with the doXML transform process if we looked at version number 1 of this legacy contribution. And just to tie up a couple of other items that I mentioned earlier, let's go back to Designer for a moment. And let's say that this project relied on resources within the quote processing project. If I right mouse on the project folder and go to Properties, then Project References, I now have the option of referring to resources within other projects that are in my workspace. And finally, as you've seen, we're really talking about deploying at the project level with ActiveVOS 8. Doing so potentially opens the door to deploying things that aren't really needed at runtime. For instance, there's no need to deploy sample data or simulation models because they're only used in development. If I go to Window, Preferences, ActiveVOS, Contributions, I can customize the list of folders that are to not be included as part of a default export. For more information on deployment within 8.0, please refer to product documentation. Thank you.